What's up, everybody? Anini Corp, Stack.farm. Learn to grow your own food. Winter is coming, man. I cannot believe how much airtime carbon dioxide gets in the press. Like everything the press does, they focus on 2% of the issue or some 5% of the issue and they make it 95% of the story. Organic farming, venture capital, and carbon dioxide. As far as I can tell, there's no threat to humanity from carbon dioxide levels tripling from where they are now, 3.9 to 1.12% even. Excuse me, 3.9 parts per million, which is really 3% of our atmosphere. 3.2% of our atmosphere is it's 3.2% of our atmosphere, but we measure it in 390 parts per million. 390 parts per million sounds a lot scarier than 3.9%. Plants have evolved to thrive at 3 to 4 thousand parts per million. Is that right? What is the threshold? Humans can survive, plants can thrive, and humans can be healthy at 1,000 parts per million. So in a greenhouse, you have 10% carbon dioxide, and you grow more food because the plants can turn more of that into growth. I don't actually know the mechanism behind that. They use photons from the light to sequester, break apart, oxidize carbon dioxide, and they get more than one electron from that. Something like that. And they use that to do everything that we take for granted on Earth. And so I'm not going to get into the arguments against it. It's stupid. You look at any of the math, it's garbage. There's no predictions, accurate predictions. That's bad for a theory. Plants need more to do better, and humans can handle way more. And our output of carbon dioxide is so little, seemingly, compared to what other fucking natural and industrial sources create. At the same time, a global warming event would be a godsend. What you don't want is a global cooling event. If you've listened to Randall Carlson on Joe Rogan talk about ice ages and how global cooling, he may or may not have said this, but global cooling decreases lifespans and wealth, prosperity across the planet. Global warming periods coincide with the Renaissance and increased, from what I remember, increase human prosperity. There's more food, less people have to grow, less people have to spend time growing the amount of food we need, and there's a surplus, so even less people have to worry about food. You can start thinking about ideas, and you can turn those ideas into capital, into cash, into prosperity. Likewise, when the temperature drops, there's excess snow cover, there's colder temperatures, there's lower yields from plants, there's lower immune systems in people, there is less food, there's famine, there's less lowered immune systems, more diseases, more time spent trying to grow, less food, less calories out. You end up with the medieval times, the Dark Ages, right? And okay, that's all anecdotal, Amini. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so I studied physics just to be able to read scientific papers. Ultimately, the joy and thrill I got of reading random ass scientific papers across, physics papers particularly, across the web was what kept me pushing through my physics classes. And I ended up just doing the physics homework so I could understand the logic and story behind, this is going to drive me crazy, behind people's experiments or theories. And I found it to be awesome. It's like a superpower. You get to read something that most people don't understand. And better yet, you get to understand where the author was coming from and pick apart their argument. All science is two things: experiments, conjectures, ideas, and experiments to discover those ideas. Those ideas are really stories that have to fit as much of the data as possible. So we're constantly drawing conclusions, and we are always in science as a species ignoring some of the data, because no one theory explains all the data. It's yet to happen. And so you end up with these outliers, and you have to ignore them sometimes to propose or to accept a theory that explains enough to predict something new that's been unverified. So a theory has to be falsifiable through experiment. There is no experiment. The experiment is the Earth, so it's hard to falsify global warming. Now, a professor, so it's only 3% of the atmosphere, and we went from whatever 3.5% to 4.2 is going to be the end of us all, 420 parts per million. All the predictions of the models, remember the inconvenient truth? That thing scared the shit out of me. Changed my life. I thought we were all going to die. For like 5 years, I thought we were all going to die. And all their predictions have not come true. And then you look, I won't even get into just the idea of ice core samples and global temperature measurements and their standards. It's like you can do it a million different ways. There's a million different ways. How do you know the Earth is warming up? There's not a thermometer at the center you can stick like a turkey and figure it out. So you have to take thermometers, and they're not thermometers, they're sensors of different kinds, because a thermometer is a sensor for dummies at home, but in the scientific community you have much more advanced sensors, and you spread them across the planet. However, where do you put them? The Earth's temperature varies dramatically from the Death Valley, right, to the top of Mount Everest, where you can't stay for more than a few minutes until you die, and probably similarly in parts of Death Valley, a few hours, let's say. Who knows? I don't know. But my point being is you have to decide where to put them. So elevation matters, sunlight matters. There's so many variables that go into it. How many places did you put these sensors to? Every square mile? You know what I'm saying? So you end up with a very amorphous definition of global temperature. And I promise you, first off, if you want to be an expert in anything, you have to understand the full spectrum of thoughts. If you want to be an expert in political science, you have to understand both parties. If you want to be an expert in history, at a war, you have to understand both sides of the war. In science, you're not going to go and get a grant and become a scientist. Most person isn't. But to have a reasonable understanding of the situation, you have to understand both sides of the debate. Most people have never even read the pro-global warming side. Nobody who's pro-global warming has read the anthropomorphic global warming side, right? Who's reading source material here? Nobody. But they'll balk at you. And that's immediately like, anywhere there's censorship, there's bullshit, okay? Go look into it and explore both sides. And you could go back and forth forever. But at the end of the day, the Earth is the experiment, right? So how do you know for certain which side of this argument is correct? Well, a physicist, female physicist out of, I can't remember where she was born. Former Soviet country, and her name is hard for me to remember. It's a very Eastern European last name. Anyway, she has presented and I'll link it below. Her and her team, multiple teams, they studied the magnetic field of the sun. And they ran it through a computer that produced an equation to explain or map the magnetic field intensity of the sun with all its crazy cycles, and this equation, which was just brute force, you put in a bunch of data in certain circumstances, you can find the equation that maps the data. And of course, the better fit the data is to your equation, the more valid is the equation. Secondly, and there's many ways to do that. Sometimes it's how do I say this? There's always manual ways to do it. Sometimes the manual way to take data and find the equation from it is so hard that it's not yet been done until computing power is increased to the point and decrease in cost to the point where people can have the computer manually do this. There's processes or use different mathematical tools on data to find patterns that they put in that form an equation. Now, there's all of math is a set of tools, various tools to use to do different things in the language of math, which is ultimately logic. If this, then that. Physics is the application of those tools to reality via experiment. And so you can go and think about whatever you want. At the end of the day, you have to measure something and report those measurements and have other people verify those measurements through independent duplication of your process to have a real finding. So this team loaded all this data from sunspot activity, solar magnetic field activity, which is correlated to sunspots directly. Sunspots are an occurrence of magnetic fields like bending. And they crunched this crazy, they use these tools, they crunched this crazy amount of data, which has only been collected since like 20, very recently. We had magnetic sensor on the sun. I can't remember very recent though. And then only very, very recently did we have the power to, the computing power to run this analysis. So they do it, and they find this equation, and it fits very accurately all the historical data for the sun, and all the magnetic data from the sun, from the sensor and the satellite that's been up there for like a couple decades maybe. However, magnetic activity in the sun is directly proportional to magnetic solar, what are they called? Sunspots. Sunspots are caused by magnetic activity. So measuring sunspots, occurrence of sunspots, gives you an idea of magnetic activity also, an incomplete but relationship or proportional understanding. And sunspots, it turns out, have been observed all the way to like 0 AD by ancient Chinese astronomers. And their model detects that matches perfectly with all historical solar magnetic observations, sunspots and fields, magnetic fields. That's crazy. Like, that means your model, your equation, is highly accurate. And if it's true, if it truly describes reality, it has physical validation or physical utility, it will predict something that we haven't seen. If you have a model in physics, the first thing is it tends to need to be more elegant. It needs to cover as much previous data as other models have before and predict something new. If your physics theorem or hypothesis or model don't do those things, then it's a shit model. Elegance is one thing, but it has to predict something. It has to be falsifiable as well. You should be able to do something, test it, and prove that this is wrong. So this equation, solar magnetic equation, predicts a coming lull in solar activity. Now, magnetic activity. We're currently have entered one of the most dormant phases of the sun, but it's a lagging indicator. So it'll affect the Earth's atmosphere in the years to come. 2020 to 2025 is like a grand solar minimum. Now, she thinks food crops will be affected and there'll be food shortages in 2028 to 2032, something like that. Why? How? This is why. Because the only reason we're living right now, well, one of the billion reasons, but one of the things that's required for us to be living right now is the sun's magnetic field. It is so powerful and so big that it protects the entire solar system. It's called the heliosphere. And it keeps charged particles, high velocity charged particles, from entering the solar system and our atmosphere and our skin and our DNA, ultimately. We're living in a fucking microwave oven here, people, okay? Human life is not simply, it's not that robust given the cosmic forces at work, okay? And so, not only do we have our magnetic field, but it's nothing in comparison to the sun's magnetic field. And so the sun's magnetic field filters out the bad, the really big bad stuff. Ours filters out the rest, and we get a quality of life on Earth that's impeccable. Now, when the sun's magnetic field decreases, more of those charged particles will enter our atmosphere, and it's been shown it decreases cloud coverage, which clouds act as a blanket over the Earth, and more heat will be lost. So it accelerates a cooling process. The thing about the IPCC reports, when you look at them, always look at the conclusions drawn by scientists are directly related to their initial assumptions, always and foremost. If you assume man can't fly, you do not design an airplane, right? Or if you assume heavier than air travel is impossible, you do not design an airplane. Conclusion, result. Direct link. The IPCC says, hey, the only thing affecting Earth's climate, the temperature here, is the solar irradiance, the amount of visible light coming from the sun to the Earth. Current models, because we haven't been able to, we didn't have the data of the magnetic fields of the sun, and we didn't have the computing power to analyze them properly until very, 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 very recently, a decade or so, those combined. So no one even thought to bother, to assume there's anything else. Look at this giant ball of fire, it's clearly the only thing. But the magnetic field, which is not visible sunlight, there's no photons coming when the magnetic field, we're in it. It's a curvature of space itself. It's a pressure field in a sense, right? It's like you're underwater and the pressure can decrease or increase versus sound moving through the water, right? Something like that. The light is the sound, and so there's no sound, it's like pitch black. But the effect in your body is still, in this analogy at least, underwater, greatly impacted by the pressure of the water around you. Water being space-time. So, no one thought that this was a piece of it. In the federal government, the White House's Committee on Solar or Climate Change, blah, 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 IPCC report, it just came out, part 2, part 1 was under Obama, part 2 came out under Trump, and the basic assumption, the first part of part 1, maybe even repeated at the beginning of part 2, is the solar irradiance is the only factor here. And it's, therefore, the amount of light that the sun, that the Earth absorbs and reflects versus absorbs and deflects is the only factor in driving Earth's climate, temperature, ultimately. And that's just not right. That's factually incorrect. That's 100% wrong. Now, to what degree, I can't say. Is solar irradiance 90% of the factor or only 10%? Time will only tell. But I do know that there is a very valid mathematical equation that is predicted thousands of years of solar activity that is not predicted but modeled, accurately modeled. Imagine giving the computer a equation and it'll tell you any year historically how many sunspots there were, and you look at a chart and that's exactly the number of sunspots for any day going back 3,000 years or so, thousands of years. And then this same equation tells you, hey man, it's just going to get cold, and it's starting to get to it now. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. You Google solar activity, minimum like zero, almost zero. It's like dead quiet. And that's going to now affect the Earth because we're a coupled system. The Earth's magnetic field is directly affected by this. Many times more powerful. Excuse me. Thousands, if not millions of times more powerful than the sun's, right? So I'm not worried about global warming at all. 0%. I worry about every other ecological issue. I will not worry about global warming. I am a little worried about global cooling though. I'm not going to lie to you. It's going to affect the world. To what degree, I don't know. To what level, I don't know. You know, clearly, it's good that there's a bunch of commercial indoor farmers. That's why I got into it, not because of global cooling, but of food security, which climate is a part of. Now, you've heard my opinions on everyone doing it, you know. I think, God, I did not want to get sucked into this, but I see no reason why I shouldn't, and if there's a need, there's a need. I'm going to actively work to put together an information kit for anyone to start their own commercial indoor farming business for some percentage of revenue, so $0 up front, and you know, fuck it, let's do it. $9 a month is what I'm charging for my membership site for home farming. I will take 9% of your sales and provide you everything in exchange for licensing, packaging, branding, equipment designs, all that stuff. You don't grow anything, you don't make any money, you don't pay. I'm just the one wasting all my fucking time. But that's going to be a slower process. But we're going to get there. I think it's going to be dope too. First and foremost though, if you want to get into commercial farming, I'm not even guaranteeing you it's possible. Okay, so I refuse to take $1 up front for it. I will happily come and share everything I know though with anybody that wants to pay. If you care, you pay. But if you want to get into it for real, you have to build your own farm and you have to farm some of your own crops. There's no fucking way you have any chance in hell to grow food commercially if you don't know how to grow for yourself. Because you will never know the deep layers and layers of nuance that are required to grow commercially. You will never appreciate the difficulty in changing your light bulbs from one spectrum to the other. If you want to change your fixtures, and now your wattage changes across your stack, and then your farm, and your power output. It's like, it goes on and on and on and on. But, I mean, I have a bunch of crops that I know will grow well. We'll start with microgreens. Let's start with microgreens. That's a good place for the home farmer and the commercial farmer to get going. And it's the simplest. Although it's one of the smaller markets, it's the most profitable. It's the best blend of profitability and simplicity. It's like the most simple to grow, that's also the most profitable. but it only takes you to a point. So you can get your farm going that way, and then you got to expand, and maybe that's what we'll do here. In fact, I know who I'm gonna start it with. I got a cafe in my office. Maybe I'll move this rig to my office. I've been thinking about it, and grow it for the cafe across the hall. I don't know. I'll go talk to them. I'll go. Okay, so I'll show you what I'm doing. This is the same thing you got to do every time. I've done this on a MasterCard with $600 limit or $750 limit. I started one of those companies, Farm Tower, I think. Built a system, grew microgreens, took them to one of the nicest hotels in Chicago, I think, the Omni, I can't remember, and it all kind of clicked for me. Now, did I make mistakes? Yes. Did I ever collect any money? No. Will you learn exactly why? Of course. But we'll figure it out together. So I'm going to grow microgreens, and then I'm going to share them with chefs and try to get some sales and show you what's going on. Hey! Hi! Nobody. I'm talking to nobody on the internet. You guys want to come say hi? You want to come say hi? Yeah. Come. You gotta come over here. This is my daughter. Watch your words. What'd you get? Nice. Are those for me? No. Ooh la la. Daddy won a beauty contest, I guess. Ugliest horse in the race. Cool. Alright, y'all.